Everyone knows that soil is the foundation for tree growth. However, not all soils are the same, and that can have a big impact on the trees growing from it. In this video, I will be focusing on soils through the lens of conservation tree planting. However, I will be doing another video on urban soils for tree planting at a later time. Selecting trees for the site conditions we have will ensure trees live and thrive and fulfill the functions of the windbreak we have designed. When considering windbreak establishment, one interpretation we turn to is called conservation tree and shrub groups. Each tree or shrub species has certain preferences and growing conditions where a tree may be well or poorly suited to a site, and usually those are due to soil characteristics. CTSGs assure satisfactory performance under specific conditions of soil, climate, and physiography. Species are grouped according to expected height growth at 20 years, given good management. It is assumed that by 20 years of age, a tree or shrub planting is providing the planned for benefits. Conservation tree and shrub groups are a guide for selecting species best suited for different kinds of soils and for predicting height growth and effectiveness. So there's obviously a very close relationship between trees and the soils that they grow in. The soil is the storage place for water and the nitrogens and minerals dissolved in that water, which are needed by the tree to live and grow. The soil also provides a base for the tree to attach itself firmly in place. Those roots reaching out for water between the soil particles serve to anchor the tree as well, and over time provide ecosystem benefits as they grow. Soils vary across the landscape and differ according to 5 soil forming factors. Climate, or the amount of precipitation and heat that an area receives, either speeds up or slows down weathering processes. The organisms, big or small, trees or grass, influence our soil profiles. The relief, or ups and downs on the landscape, is affected by erosion and deposition of soil materials, changing these soils even though they may exist only meters away from one another. Parent material that these soils originally formed from, and time can all play a part in defining what our soils will look like on the landscape. These factors influence soil characteristics like texture, color, depth, pH, fertility, salts, and the ability to hold water. Because each tree species has different needs, it's crucial to know what kind of soil they require to grow if you want the best results. To do this, we have to know our soils, not just from a soil map, though soil maps certainly help us to get a first understanding of what our landscapes are capable of. Each soil develops distinct layers, or what we call horizons. The layers of a soil form the soil profile. The profile is distinctive for each soil type. The separate layers of a soil differ from one another in various physical and chemical characteristics. The soil layers are partially formed by the downward and sideward movement of water through the soil. This water carries with it certain dissolved materials, such as lime, salts, and very fine clay particles. The water also moves organic matter, iron compounds, and other materials from the surface down. In this diagram, we see a little closer on how relief affects soil development and horizons. These landscape positions like summit, shoulder, back slope, and foot slope play a huge role in determining the different soils and thus different CTSG groups on the landscape. We notice our topsoil, or that dark fertile layer at the surface, increases in size as we get closer to the bottom of the hill. Organic matter is able to build in those depositional positions where usually there is an increased infiltration and amount of water available for the landscape compared to upslope. It's important to note that even in a simple line across the field, you can experience changes in soil and thus a change in CTSG. If we see this block diagram of a typical Williams soil catena, we see 3 different soil types across our planting design: Zoll at the top of the hill, Williams on the side slopes, and Bowbells towards the bottom of the hill. So when you're planning your windbreak, it's important to note different CTSGs that can align with the different soils on your landscape, even if our soil map gives us one single number on the interpretation. This concept is apparent in this photo of a conifer tree planting. Do you notice that as you go upslope on that back slope position, the spruce trees are a little bit shorter? It's possible they were planted later, but it's more likely that that is a change in soil type where the slope or other soil factor has an impact on the growth rate of that tree. We see this again here. As we go downslope into the more concave position at the bottom of the hill, we start to see some tree dieback. This is likely caused by a change in soil type and site conditions that inhibit that specific tree species from thriving. My guess for this one is that there is a natural drainage at the bottom of the hill, and so maybe that area is more prone to flooding or a high water table, but that tree species isn't as suited for those conditions. CTSGs are arranged numerically from 1 to 10 in the 20-year expected tree heights publication that the NRCS put together. I have linked that in the description, but for this video, instead, I'm going to group them like the Soil Field Guide for identifying CTSGs. This field guide is a great resource for beginners to use when describing soils in the field and understanding the soils on your planned windbreak. Typically, you rule out each group starting with the most severe restrictions, but I'm going to work backwards. First, we have our CTSG Group 1 soils. These are like the Cadillac for tree planting. These soils are deep, well-drained to somewhat poorly drained, and receive beneficial moisture from favorable landscape positions, flooding, runoff from adjacent land, or they have beneficial seasonally high water tables during the spring. Soils within this group are generally fine sandy loam to silty clay loam in texture. That beneficial moisture allows our tree species to have a leg up when it comes to establishment, though they may still need supplemental watering. These soils are generally in the flats, swales, and concave landscape positions, where they receive deposition of organic material from the higher topography, so they are generally rich in organic matter and quite fertile. Some limitations with this include high pH, which can have an effect on the selection of species on some soils in this group. Competition from grass and weeds is the principal concern in establishing and managing trees and shrubs. Salinity in this group is none to slight, and occasionally somewhat poorly drained soils may have excessive water for some species. All tree species listed in the expected 20-year heights reference can thrive on soils in Group 1, and most can survive on 1K, where we see some calcium carbonate in greater quantities in the top 16 inches. However, most species will still require good site prep and weed control until canopy closure, not just 1 to 3 years post-planting. CTSG Group 3 soils are deep, well-drained, with loamy and silt loam textures and high available water capacity. They are found on the flats and rises on the landscape. These don't have quite the advantage of the landscape position and additional water that CTSG 1 soils have, which make them slightly more restrictive. Many species will thrive on these soils as well, though competition from grass and weeds is the principal concern in establishing and manning trees and shrubs. Some species, especially those non-native to North Dakota, require good site prep and weed control until canopy closure. Water erosion is also a concern on the gently sloping to moderately steep areas that these soils can be found. CTSG Group 8K soils are calcareous at or near the surface. These are generally on the knobs and knolls of hills and along ridges. They do not receive beneficial moisture from run-on, flooding, or seasonal high water tables. Limitations for these soils can include high calcium content and competition from grass and weeds. Calcium carbonate is a salt, albeit one that is not easily dissolved in water. The presence of this salt at or near the surface can cause a shift in osmotic pressure and limit our trees from taking up water that is available. Water erosion is a concern on gently sloping to moderately steep areas. While there is no restrictive layers or drainage issues impeding tree establishment on these soils, the carbonates stress our young tree seedlings, especially in their early growing years. Because of this, only a few resilient trees are approved for these sites. Next, we have our sandy and sands textural family. Drought conditions and abrasion from soil blowing are the principal concerns with these soils. Because of these sandy textures, supplemental watering may be essential for successful tree establishment. For Group 5, soils in this group are deep with loamy, fine sandy loam, and sandy loam textures. We usually find these on uplands, on the fans and terraces. Reduced available water later in the growing season reduces the number of trees suitable for these soils compared to CTSG 3 soils. For tree suitability, most conifers outside of spruce are approved for these soils, as well as bur oak and our fruiting trees on the approved list minus black cherry. Soils in group 7 are deep, excessively to moderately well drained, sandy in texture, typically have low to very low available water capacity, and do not normally have adequate moisture. They are found on the flats and hill slopes. In regards to trees on these sites, only eastern red cedar, ponderosa pine, Rocky Mountain juniper, and western sand cherry are suited. Next, we have our root restricted family. This group of CTSGs have some sort of root restriction. Soils in group 4 are moderately deep and deep, have loamy surface textures with clayey subsoils, have slow or very slow permeability, and occur on the uplands. High clay content and water availability have an effect on the selection of tree and shrub species for this soil, as fine textured soils can reduce root growth through reduced oxygen content or excess water. Many trees are suited for these soils. However, Siberian larch, ponderosa pine, and Scotch pine are not. Soils in group 6, on the other hand, are well drained, mostly loamy textures and moderately deep over sand, gravel, bedrock, and other layers that can severely restrict root growth. They have low to moderate available water capacity. Supplemental watering may be needed for establishment. Soils with only 20 to 24 inches of loam over sand and gravel exhibit reduced tree vigor and growth and survival during drought. On these family 6 shallow soils, the selection of species for trees and shrubs is quite limited. Green ash, Arnold hawthorn, Siberian elm, Russian olive, Rocky Mountain juniper, and eastern red cedar are the only tree selections that are approved for planting in the West, as well as a few shrubs. And even then, their relative height value is decreased. The East has a few more, those listed before, plus Siberian and Manchurian crabapple, ponderosa pine, and Scotch pine. Lastly, salinity or acidicity affect soils in group 9. Concentrations of salt will severely affect the establishment, vigor, and growth of trees and shrubs on these soils. Natric soils, or those that have an accumulation of sodium in their profile, can create a hard clay pan that roots and water cannot easily penetrate. On these soils, the selection of species for trees and shrubs is very limited. Green ash, Siberian elm, Russian olive, Rocky Mountain juniper, and eastern red cedar are the only tree selections that are approved for planting, as well as a few shrubs, and even then, their relative height value is decreased. Species shown as suitable for these soils may survive, but the ability of the planting to form an effective windbreak within a reasonable time frame is greatly reduced. When possible, relocate planting off of CTSG 9 soils. Soils in group 2 are deep, somewhat poorly drained, and excessively wet or ponded during the spring or overflow periods. They also include drained phases of poorly drained soils. Wetness limits the selection of species suitable for planting on these soils and may reduce the growth rate overall. Wetness, high pH, and drainage will have an effect on the selection of trees and shrubs for these soils. Spring planting may be delayed because of wet conditions, and soil blowing is a concern on the sandy and organic soils. For sites with CTSG2, many tree species are suited, including, but not limited to, poplars, cottonwood, aspen, hackberry, and willows. In the east, basswood is also included for CTSG2. Soils with 2K and 2KK have increased carbonates at or near the surface. Again, this limits tree establishment and narrows down our tree species selection. The North Dakota Forest Service, in cooperation with the NRCS and soil conservation districts, have been studying some variances for 2KK soil specifically, and hope to provide you with an update on that at a later time. Lastly, we have CTSG group 10, and usually this is a big fat no for tree planting. Soils in this group have one or more characteristics such as soil depth, texture, drainage, channeled phases, available water capacity, slope, or salts which severely limit planting, survival, and growth of trees. These soils are usually not recommended for farmsteads and feedlot windbreaks, field windbreaks, and plantings for recreation and wildlife. However, on-site investigations may reveal that tree and shrub plantings can be made with special treatments, including hand planting, scalp planting, specialized site prep, drainage, and other specialized treatments. The selection of species must be tailored to the soil conditions existing at each site. CTSG Group 10 soils would include all shallow soils, undrained phases of very poorly drained soils, all soils with less than 20 inches of loamy fine sand or coarser surface material, all moderately and strongly saline soils, and other CTSGs that are on limiting steep slope for their group. Experience has shown that when windbreaks are placed on slopes greater than 15%, erosion control and moisture management measures need to be considered. Machine planting of windbreaks become limiting, and the impact of the slope on placement of windbreaks must also be considered in designing your windbreak. Even when establishment is successful, long-term survival and effectiveness is often reduced on these steep slopes. This, of course, is no substitute for following the actual document and guidelines, and only means to expose you to what these CTSG groups mean. I encourage you to visit the link in the description to learn more in depth about the specific trees suited to your site. Thanks for watching. For more info on trees and forest management, you can visit our North Dakota Forest Service website listed here. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at North Dakota Forest Service, or scan the QR code to visit our Forestry Fridays YouTube channel, where we upload new videos every Friday.